Hi everyone. Before we dive in, I want to share something personal. A few years ago, I was sitting across from someone I deeply respected. We were having one of those conversations where you don't just talk, you wrestle with ideas. I asked her how she understood courage, and she paused, smiled, and said, "Well, in my language, courage literally means heart speak. It's not about fearlessness. It's about telling the truth from the heart." That moment changed something in me. It made me realize, language is more than words, it's a worldview. Lera Boroditsky, a cognitive scientist and one of the brilliant minds pushing us to rethink what we think we know, tells us something radical. The languages we speak don't just reflect how we think, they shape it. Let's break that down. In some Aboriginal communities in Australia, people don't use words like left and right. Instead, they say north, south, east, and west even in casual conversation. "There's an ant on your southwest leg." And what that means is, these folks are constantly oriented. It's not a party trick. It's embedded in the way they speak, and therefore, how they think. That blew my mind. Because what Lera is really showing us is this. If your language forces you to identify the gender of a bridge or assign direction to everything you do, your brain learns to think that way. And it does it without asking your permission. You're being shaped. Silently. Constantly. So, what does this mean for us as learners, as leaders, as humans trying to connect? It means we need to get curious. Curiosity is our superpower. And in the case of language, it means stepping into the unfamiliar, the uncomfortable, and the beautifully different. Because here's the truth. Speech balloon: when we only speak one language, we live inside a single lens. But when we learn another, we don't just add words, we expand our minds. We build bridges. We shift perspective. We grow. Now, I'm not saying you need to master 5 languages to be wise. But I am saying, listen more deeply. Ask questions about how other people see the world. Pay attention to the words they use, not just what they mean, but what they reveal. Lera is teaching us that language is cognitive architecture. And just like architecture, it determines what's visible, what's possible, and what gets built. So let's build something brave. Let's choose to learn from each other's words and ways of thinking. Because when we do, we don't just understand the world better, we understand ourselves better. 2. Language is not just a tool for communication, it's a lens through which we experience reality. We often think of language as something external, as a system we use to describe what's already there, a neutral container for facts, feelings, or ideas. But what if I told you that language doesn't just describe our reality, it actually creates it? That the words we use don't just express thoughts, but shape the very way we think? It's easy to overlook this idea because we are so immersed in our native language that we rarely step outside of it. Much like a fish doesn't notice the water it swims in, we often don't realize how deeply language influences our perception. But the research of cognitive scientists like Lera Boroditsky brings this concept into sharp focus. Through studies across cultures, languages, and cognitive tasks, we see something profound. Different languages produce fundamentally different ways of understanding the world. Take something as seemingly basic as direction. In English, we use words like left and right to describe where things are. But in some indigenous Australian languages, like Kuuk-Thayera, they don't use relative directions like left and right at all. Instead, they use cardinal directions: north, south, east, west for everything. So instead of saying, "Your phone is to your left," a speaker would say, "Your phone is southwest of your foot." To use this system, you have to be constantly aware of your orientation in the world. And as a result, people in those communities develop an extraordinary sense of direction, so finely tuned that they can accurately point north even in unfamiliar places or inside buildings with no windows. What's important here isn't just the language difference itself, but how that difference teaches the brain to think. When your language requires you to pay attention to geography all the time, your brain adapts. It becomes habit. You learn to see the world spatially, consistently, and with remarkable accuracy. This isn't just a linguistic skill, it's a way of perceiving and understanding the world that is different from someone who has never had to think that way. Language also shapes how we experience time. In English, we tend to think of time as moving from left to right, because that's the direction in which we read and write. But in cultures that read from right to left, like Arabic or Hebrew, people often visualize time flowing in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, speakers of the Aymara language in South America conceive of the future as behind them because it's unknown and the past as in front of them, because it's already seen. This flips the English metaphor on its head, and it's not just poetic, it actually influences how people gesture when they talk, how they describe memories, and how they anticipate the future. And this influence extends into how we think about agency and responsibility. For example, in English we might say, "He broke the vase," even if it was an accident. In Spanish or Japanese, the phrasing would more likely be, "The vase broke itself," or "The vase was broken," especially if it was unintentional. Studies have shown that this grammatical difference affects how speakers of each language assign blame. English speakers are more likely to remember who did it, while Spanish or Japanese speakers are more likely to focus on what happened. This difference has real-world consequences in legal settings, eyewitness testimony, and even how we interpret other people's intentions. These are just a few examples, but the pattern is clear. The structure and vocabulary of a language influence what its speakers notice, how they categorize information, and how they interpret events. Our languages don't just give us tools for expressing our thoughts, they give us the very tools for thinking. This doesn't mean that language imprisons us or limits what we're capable of understanding. It means that language acts as a cognitive filter. It emphasizes certain things and de-emphasizes others. It directs our attention. And over time, it subtly wires our brains to favor particular ways of seeing the world. That's why bilingual individuals often report feeling like slightly different versions of themselves depending on the language they're speaking. It's not just that the words change, it's that the way they think and feel in those words changes, too. Now, why does this matter? Because in a world that's increasingly connected, diverse, and interdependent, understanding the role of language in shaping thought is more than an intellectual exercise, it's a necessary act of empathy. When we recognize that people from different cultures truly see the world differently because they speak about it differently, we move closer to genuine understanding. We move away from judgment and toward curiosity. We stop assuming that our way of thinking is the only way or the right way, and we start to appreciate the richness of human experience in all its variety. And it's not just about appreciating diversity, it's also about expanding our own cognitive toolkit. Learning a new language, or even just becoming aware of how other languages work, can stretch our minds in new directions. It can challenge our assumptions. It can make us better problem solvers, better communicators, and better listeners. It teaches us that reality is not fixed, it is interpreted. And the more ways we have to interpret it, the more fully we can understand it. So when we say that language is a lens, we mean that it frames our view of reality. But unlike glasses, we're not always aware we're wearing them. Part of our educational and personal growth should be to recognize the lenses we've inherited and to try on a few new ones. Because in doing so, we're not just learning new words, we're learning new ways to be in the world. Language, then, is not just about what we say. It's about how we see, how we think, and ultimately, how we connect with each other. And I think that's a beautiful, brave place to begin. Different languages lead to different cognitive patterns. On the surface, that may sound like a simple statement, something we might nod along to without thinking too deeply. But if we pause and sit with that idea, we begin to uncover a profound truth about the human mind. The structure of our language influences the structure of our thought. The way we process information, solve problems, recall memories, and even form our identities is not happening in isolation, it's happening through the lens of the language we speak. It's easy to assume that all humans think in fundamentally the same way, and that language is just a different way of saying the same things. But research has repeatedly shown that this isn't the case. In fact, what we consider to be common sense, logical, or even intuitive is often shaped by the linguistic habits we've been using since we were toddlers. This doesn't just change how we communicate, it changes how we think. Let's look at one of the most compelling examples, how people perceive and describe color. You might think that color is a straightforward thing, that the sky is blue, grass is green, and roses are red. But in some languages, the spectrum of color is divided differently, and that changes what speakers actually see. Russian, for instance, has separate words for light blue, goluboi, and dark blue, siny, and studies show that Russian speakers are faster than English speakers at distinguishing between shades of blue. Because their language makes a clear distinction, their brains become wired to notice those distinctions more readily. The categories provided by language don't just help us label things, they literally change how finely we perceive them. Another example comes from how languages encode time and space. In English, we tend to describe time using spatial metaphors, looking forward to the future, putting the past behind us. But in Mandarin, time is often described vertically. The next month might be the down month, and the previous one is the up month. And research has found that Mandarin speakers tend to think about time differently as a result. When asked to arrange cards showing a temporal sequence, English speakers often line them up left to right, while Mandarin speakers are more likely to stack them vertically. It's a simple exercise, but it reveals how the internal maps in our minds are shaped by the linguistic pathways we've traveled all our lives. There's also the way languages handle numbers and counting. In languages with highly regular number systems like Chinese, where the word for 11 is 10-1 and 12 is 10-2, children tend to learn to count and do basic arithmetic faster than children who grow up speaking languages with irregular systems, like English. This isn't about intelligence. It's about how the structure of a language either supports or complicates a developing cognitive skill. The regularity of Chinese number words aligns more closely with base 10 counting, making it easier for children to grasp mathematical concepts. The language gives them a head start not because they're inherently better at math, but because the linguistic patterns support that kind of thinking more clearly and consistently. Then there's gender in language, and how it impacts perception. In languages that assign gender to nouns like German or Spanish, people often associate objects with characteristics that align with the gender of the word. For example, in Spanish, the word for bridge is masculine, and speakers might describe it as strong, long, or sturdy. In German, bridge is feminine, and speakers are more likely to describe it as elegant, beautiful, or slender. These are not random associations. They reflect a pattern that emerges from the grammatical structure of the language itself, and over time, these patterns reinforce certain ways of thinking. It's important to clarify that this doesn't mean speakers of one language are incapable of understanding concepts expressed in another language. Of course, we can learn to see things from different perspectives. What it does mean, however, is that our default ways of interpreting the world, what we notice, what we prioritize, what we remember, are deeply influenced by the language we use every day. This idea that different languages create different patterns of thought isn't about division or limitation. It's about diversity. It's about the remarkable adaptability of the human mind. It shows us that there's no single, fixed way to think, and that our thoughts are more flexible, more culturally influenced, and more dynamic than we might believe. And that's powerful. It means we can grow. It means we can expand our awareness. It means we can build bridges between ways of knowing. In today's interconnected world, understanding that language shapes cognition isn't just a fascinating fact, it's a necessary skill. When we work, live, and learn alongside people from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, being mindful of how their languages might shape their cognitive experiences helps us become more empathetic, more patient, and more collaborative. It reminds us to listen not just to the words someone uses, but to the patterns of meaning behind those words. It challenges us to question our assumptions and to recognize that our own way of thinking, while familiar and comfortable, is not the only way. Learning another language, even at a basic level, can start to shift our own cognitive patterns. We begin to notice things we didn't before. We gain new metaphors, new mental models, and sometimes even a new sense of self. Bilingual people often say they feel slightly different when they switch languages, not just in how they speak, but in how they feel, how they relate to others, how they solve problems. And that makes sense. They are, in a very real way, thinking differently. The brain is operating in a new mode. So when we say that different languages lead to different cognitive patterns, what we're really talking about is the astonishing ability of language to sculpt thought. And that sculpting happens over time, quietly, in the background of our lives. But its impact is enormous. It shapes our memories, our attention, our decisions, and our values. It molds our understanding of time, space, relationships, and responsibility. It plays a role in our creativity, our problem solving, and even our morality. Language is more than a reflection of thought, it's an architect of it. And when we begin to recognize and explore that architecture, we open ourselves up to richer, deeper ways of understanding ourselves and each other. Language affects memory and attention in ways that we often don't notice, and yet, these effects are deeply woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. We like to think that our memories are objective, that we remember what happened, plain and simple. But the truth is, memory is not a perfect recording device, it's shaped by what we notice, how we interpret what we notice, and most importantly, the language we have available to describe it. The way we speak influences what we pay attention to in the first place, and therefore, what we are even capable of remembering. And once something is stored in memory, language can reshape it every time we recall it. This becomes especially clear when we consider how different languages guide our attention towards certain features of the world. Some languages require their speakers to specify details that others leave optional or unmentioned. For instance, in English, we often say things like "she broke the vase," regardless of whether it was intentional or accidental. The structure of the sentence emphasizes the agent, the person who performed the action. In other languages, such as Spanish or Japanese, it's more common to phrase the same event as "the vase broke," especially when the act was unintentional. That grammatical difference might seem small, but it influences how speakers of each language encode the event in memory. In psychological studies, English speakers were more likely to remember who caused an accidental breakage, while speakers of Spanish or Japanese remembered the event itself but not necessarily the person who caused it. Because English draws attention to the agent, that's what sticks in memory. The same kind of pattern shows up in studies of visual attention. In one experiment, speakers of English and speakers of a language called Giguumathur, spoken in northern Australia, were asked to describe the arrangement of objects on a table. English speakers typically used egocentric directions like "to my left" or "in front of me." Giguumathur speakers, however, used absolute directions like "to the south" or "west of the cup," even indoors. Their language requires constant awareness of cardinal directions, and as a result, their attention is tuned to those spatial cues in the environment. This isn't just about how they speak, it's about how their brains have been trained to notice what's around them. Because they've learned to pay attention to direction in every interaction, they're more likely to remember spatial information in ways that others might not. Even the way we describe colors can impact memory and attention. In some languages, there are more words for particular color ranges, and in others, fewer. For example, the Himba people of Namibia have different color groupings than English speakers. They have no separate words for blue and green, instead grouping them under a single term, but they have many more distinctions within what English speakers might just call green. In experiments where participants were shown color swatches, Himba speakers were faster and more accurate at spotting subtle differences between shades of green, while English speakers were quicker at identifying differences between blue and green. What you have words for, you tend to notice more. And what you notice, you remember. This connection between attention and language also shows up in gendered languages, where nouns are assigned grammatical gender. In languages like German or Spanish, objects like bridge or clock are treated as either masculine or feminine. This subtle grammatical feature actually influences how speakers remember and describe those objects. For instance, if a noun is grammatically feminine, speakers are more likely to associate it with traits like elegance or delicacy. If it's grammatically masculine, they may associate it with strength or rigidity. These associations shape the kinds of adjectives people use, which in turn shapes the mental image stored in memory. Again, it's not that people consciously decide to describe a bridge as delicate because the word is feminine, it's that their language has trained them to focus on particular features, to associate certain qualities, and to remember accordingly. Language doesn't just guide attention outward, toward the external world, it also shapes how we focus internally, on our own experiences. Think about how vocabulary gives form to emotion. In English, we might use broad words like sad or angry. But other languages have finely tuned emotional vocabularies. For example, in Russian, there are multiple words for shades of sadness, and in Japanese, there are terms for feelings that don't even exist in English, like natsukashii, a nostalgic longing for something from the past that is both happy and a little sad. When a language gives you a word for a feeling, it allows you to pay attention to it, to name it, to hold it in your awareness in a more precise way. And that, in turn, makes it more memorable. You're more likely to recall an emotional experience if you had the language to label it clearly when it happened. This principle also plays out in how children develop memory and attention. Studies show that kids who grow up in environments rich in descriptive, narrative language tend to develop stronger autobiographical memories. When parents talk to young children in detail about past events, remember when we went to the zoo and saw the big gray elephant that splashed water on us? Those children learn not only to remember more vividly but also to focus their attention more selectively. They become more aware of sensory details, sequences, and emotions. Language doesn't just help them store memories, it helps them shape what gets stored in the first place. What we see across all of this is a kind of feedback loop. Language draws our attention to certain features of the world. Those features become more salient, more detailed, more vivid. And because we noticed them, we are more likely to remember them. When we recall those memories, we are likely to use language again, which reinforces the patterns of attention that shaped the memory in the first place. It's a continuous cycle: language directing attention, attention shaping memory, memory reinforcing language. This is why the study of language is so important, not just for linguists or psychologists, but for all of us. Because if we understand how language affects memory and attention, we can become more intentional in how we communicate. We can teach more clearly, lead more effectively, and connect more deeply. We can recognize the ways our own language may be limiting our perspective, and we can open ourselves to the possibility that there are other ways of seeing, remembering, and understanding the world. And maybe most importantly, we can begin to treat language not just as a set of words, but as a powerful tool for shaping awareness. What we pay attention to becomes the material of our lives. And the words we use guide that attention, every single day. We can expand our thinking by learning new languages. That might sound like a nice idea, something we'd see on a poster in a school hallway or a slide in a presentation about global citizenship. But when we take a closer look, when we really understand the science, the stories, and the lived experiences behind that statement, it becomes clear that this isn't just a feel-good sentiment. It's a cognitive, emotional, and even relational truth. Learning a new language doesn't just help us talk to more people. It fundamentally changes how we think, how we perceive the world, and how we relate to others and to ourselves. When we begin learning a new language, it can feel awkward. We stumble over words, forget basic vocabulary, and often feel like we're back in kindergarten, trying to piece together a full thought with broken parts. But that process, that slowing down, that conscious effort is exactly where the magic begins. When we learn another language, we're not just translating words from one tongue to another. We're stepping into a new framework for reality. We're learning to see what others notice first, to categorize ideas differently, to give names to things we didn't even know we could name. And slowly, our brain begins to adapt, not just by adding new words, but by building new mental models. One of the most powerful cognitive benefits of language learning is flexibility. The brain is constantly updating its predictions and judgments based on what it knows, and language is one of its core tools. When we speak only one language, our brain gets used to a certain rhythm and logic. But when we introduce a second or third language, we're teaching our mind to think in alternate pathways. We're giving ourselves more than one map of the world. Research shows that bilingual or multilingual individuals are often better at switching between tasks, understanding perspective, and solving problems that require creative thinking. They're used to navigating between different systems, and that cognitive flexibility spills over into other areas of life. Language learning also invites us to pay attention in new ways. Words shape perception, and new words draw our attention to things we may have overlooked before. Take, for instance, how different languages categorize emotions. In English, we might feel tired or nervous or happy. But in other languages, there are words for very specific experiences we may not even think to name in English. In Portuguese, saudade describes a deep emotional state of nostalgic longing. In Tagalog, kilig captures the fluttery, giddy feeling of romantic excitement. When we learn these words, we don't just learn to speak them, we start to recognize those feelings more vividly. We expand our emotional vocabulary, which means we expand our emotional awareness. We become more attuned to nuance, both in ourselves and in others. Learning a new language also reshapes how we experience time, space, and agency. Some languages place the past behind us and the future in front of us, while others reverse that entirely. Some require speakers to mark whether information is known firsthand or reported by someone else. Others make speakers identify the exact direction they're facing at all times. These linguistic structures don't just change how we speak, they shape our habits of attention. As we learn them, we begin to see the world through those filters. And with each new lens, our thinking expands just a little more. Beyond the cognitive and perceptual benefits, language learning is also an act of empathy. When we learn another person's language, we are not just gaining a practical skill, we are extending an invitation. We're saying, I want to understand you on your terms. It's a powerful way of acknowledging someone else's culture, history, and worldview. And in that process, we often find ourselves changed. We become more open, more curious, more capable of sitting with complexity. We develop what Brené Brown might call wholeheartedness, the willingness to lean into discomfort in service of deeper connection. In fact, studies have shown that people who speak multiple languages often report feeling slightly different depending on the language they're using. Their tone, gestures, even their sense of humor might shift. This isn't about pretending to be someone else. It's about unlocking different parts of who we are. Each language brings out a different emotional palette, a different rhythm of thought, a different sense of identity. And rather than being fragmented, this multiplicity actually makes us more whole. It reveals that we are not fixed beings with a single voice, we are layered, evolving, and capable of transformation. There's also something incredibly humbling about learning a new language, especially as an adult. It reminds us what it feels like to be a beginner. It teaches us to be patient with ourselves, to laugh at our mistakes, and to trust that fluency is built one moment of courage at a time. In a world that often rewards certainty and speed, language learning invites us to slow down and listen. To wonder. To try again. And that vulnerability, the willingness to say the wrong thing, to ask for help, to keep going even when it's hard, is where so much of our growth happens. And let's not forget the social dimension. When we speak another language, we open the door to conversations we never could have had otherwise. We gain access to stories, songs, jokes, histories, and wisdom that don't always translate. We connect with people more deeply, not just because we understand their words, but because we've invested the effort to meet them where they are. And those connections built on mutual effort and understanding are some of the most meaningful we can make. So when we say that learning a new language expands our thinking, we're talking about much more than vocabulary or grammar. We're talking about expanding our mindset, our awareness, our heart. We're talking about becoming people who are more attuned to difference, more grounded in compassion, and more resilient in the face of challenge. We're talking about giving ourselves the tools to think more clearly, feel more deeply, and connect more fully. Learning a language is not just about the words. It's about what those words make possible. It's about who we become in the process. And in that becoming, we don't just learn to speak differently, we learn to think, to listen, and to live differently. Thank you so much for watching, my friends. If you enjoyed this and found it meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to keep learning and growing together. See you in the next one.